Again, to borrow from Woody Allen, he said, you know what, I like my immortality to be literal. I don't want to be known forever by my work. I want to be known by living forever. In other words, if push comes to shove, the average person would prefer literal immortality to symbolic immortality, and that's the primary function of organized religion, with one or two important exceptions, and I think even these are explicable in the context of the theory that I now advance. Every organized religion offers some hope of immortality to individuals who behave on earth in a way that will then get them to everlasting life in the future. So most of us are familiar with the Christian afterlife. Some of us are familiar with the Hindu notion that you keep coming back until you get it right. And then you get to exist in perpetuity in some kind of ephemeral mist, and I don't mean any of this cynically. I should point, all cultures, as far as we know, offer some hope of literal immortality to their constituents. And so one point that Becker makes is that culture provides us with a sense that we live in a meaningful universe. He insists, however, that while the belief that life has meaning is necessary, it's not in and of itself sufficient for psychological equanimity. In addition to the idea that the world is meaningful, he claims that each of us needs to believe that we as individuals serve a valuable and significant role in that meaningful universe. How many of you, when you were little, long before you maybe are the way you are today, ever dreamed of doing something special or important? Whoever laid around in your bed at night and said, yo, I'm going to win a Nobel Prize, or I'm going to win an Olympic medal, or I'm going to discover a cure for cancer. I used to do all those things at once. I'd be like, I'll win a gold medal, and I'll get a Nobel Prize, and then I'll write a book on the plane over to get it, and so on. But maybe that's just me. Some of you all may be more content for a more modest dose of heroism. The point that Becker makes is that that's not the raving lunacy of a narcissist. It may be in my case, but rather the normal yearning of the human animal. We each want to feel like we serve a valuable and significant role in the universe. And the way that culture allows us to pull this off is by the provision of social roles with associated prescriptions of acceptable conduct, the satisfaction of which allows you to perceive yourself as a person of value in a world of meaning. And if you're lucky enough to feel that way, in his language, you have self-esteem. So for Becker, self-esteem is the dominant motive of the human animal. It consists of the belief that you are a person of value in a world of meaning. It is the psychological mechanism by which culture exerts its anxiety-reducing, death-denying influence. Well, that's what Becker has to say. In fact, he has a lot more to say, and I'll leave it to some other folks that you'll hear this weekend to do that. But now the question becomes, so what? If, or how rather, does this analysis help us understand human beings' atrocious propensity to be brutal to those that are different than themselves? And here Becker offers us two really, I think, profoundly stunning insights in another book with evil in the title called Escape from Evil. All right, now Becker says, look, if in fact I'm right, if your beliefs about the nature of reality serve a death-denying function, then there's two problems. Problem number one is what happens when you encounter someone who has different beliefs. All right, Becker's point is whether you're aware of it or not, the very existence of an alternative conception of reality is fundamentally threatening. Because if you believe something, let's say that God created the earth in 6 days before taking a well-deserved break on the 7th, and you run into, let's say, someone from the South Pacific where they believe that the earth emerged from a giant coconut shell out of the side of a palm tree, well, there's a problem. Because if you accept the validity of an alternative conception of reality, you do so necessarily by undermining the confidence with which you subscribe to your own perspective. And when you do that, you expose yourself to the very anxiety that your beliefs were constructed to reduce. Does that make sense? That's the closest thing to a technical thought that I have. So I'm going to actually say that again because Becker is very clear about what's happening theoretically here. If your beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function when you run into somebody who's different, that's problematic. Because if you accept their beliefs, you necessarily undermine the confidence that you have in your own. When you do that, you expose yourself to the very anxiety that those beliefs were designed to ward off, and when that happens, it instigates a host of compensatory psychological mechanisms that are designed to restore your psychological equanimity. All right, so that's point number one, is that if Becker's ideas are true, then we're going to have a problem when we run into people that are different than ourselves. All right, point number two is in some ways even more gruesome and discombobulating, because what Becker goes on to say is, you know what? Even if there weren't different people around to annoy us, we would designate somebody as different because we have to. All right, well, his argument is as follows, as articulated in the Escape from Evil book. What he says is, look, no matter how powerful and convincing your culture is, it is ultimately a symbol. All cultural constructs are symbolic. They're human creations. All right. However, death is a very real physical phenomenon. And the point that Becker makes very simply is that no symbol, regardless of its power or potency, will ever be sufficient to overcome the physical reality of death. It's like mixing apples and oranges. Consequently, and I've got to degenerate into some psychoanalytical language, which is probably okay for some, less so for others, what Becker says, again borrowing from William James, he says, you know what? Therefore, no matter how good your culture is or how much you believe in it, there's always going to be some residual anxiety about death. And you're not aware of that, he claims, because that anxiety is repressed. And then using Freud's ideas, what Becker says is that repressed anxiety is projected onto another group of individuals, either inside or outside of your culture, that you designate as the all-encompassing repository of evil, the eradication of which would make life on earth as it is in heaven. He calls them scapegoats, and I think we're familiar with them. They're either in-house or external ones. Either way, Becker says, we've got a problem. Either you run into people that are different, and that's a problem, or you declare somebody to be different, and that's a problem. Because what Becker then goes on to do, borrowing very heavily from some sociologists that we're very fond of, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, in a book called The Social Construction of Reality, what Becker does, following Berger and Luckman, is to talk about the psychological processes that are instigated when people encounter others who do not share their beliefs or encounter somebody who they have designated as different. I'm going to abridge this list a bit just to get us through the evening and just stick to the basics and talk about three reactions that we're all familiar with. Reaction number one, we call derogation. I think because Berger and Luckman called it that. That's just a high-dollar word for berating or belittling somebody. So I believe that God created the earth in 6 days and took a break. Those people in the South Pacific believe that the earth was created out of a giant coconut shell. Well, is that a problem? Of course not. Those are ignorant savages that live in huts and worship piles of sticks and mud. They don't have CNN or email or beepers, and so no wonder they have such a stupid conception of reality. I'm being facetious here. I'm not meaning to be taken literally. The point that I want to make is that the first line of psychological defense when we encounter those that are different than ourselves is to belittle the possessors of an alternative conception of reality as a subhuman, unintelligent form of life, because once we do that, that diminishes the challenge that their conception of reality poses to us. How's that sound? Does that make sense? A couple of head shakes for an emotional boost. Awesome. All right, thing number two is while we berate these folks, we generally simultaneously try to get them to divest their ridiculous ideas about the nature of reality and to adopt ours instead. I think Berger and Luckman call this assimilation, or we do, I can't remember, but we're more familiar with the term conversion, and this usually happens either politically or religiously. And so the next thing that we try to do is to get folks to drop their ideas and to adopt ours instead. And let's think about this for a moment, because I think this is very important. It certainly is for Becker, because we need to understand what's at stake. Becker's point is that there's a sense in which culture is a shared illusion. And what he means by that very simply is that if we grant that cultural beliefs are human constructions, what we also need to note is that there's lots of different ways to apprehend reality, and there's no absolute way to insist that any one of them is of necessity better than another. How's that sound? Well, as a result, the way that we maintain confidence in our beliefs is by social consensus. So the more people that share our beliefs, the more confident we can be that they're correct. And again, I mean no offense, although I'd be happy to offend if necessary.